I've looked at the Torah, I've looked at the First Testament. They're all basically the same. They have the same prophets. So, I mean, I think the idea that like there's one size fits all, that doesn't make sense to me. And I don't think it needs to make sense. My higher power has always been talking to me. You just have to be able to listen. And the best way to do that, especially as alcoholics, at least for me, is to clear all that noise out with all the booze I was drinking and just be able to listen. Make your higher power the good you see in people. Make your higher power the promises that you see working in AA rooms every day. Make your higher power whoever you need your higher power to be in order to get through it. You know, one of the adages I always hold through sobriety is this idea of heal so that your trauma does not become tradition.
Welcome to the Daily Reflection Podcast with your hosts Michael L. and Lee M. On this show, we try to bring inspiration through interviews with members of the recovery community. You're not affiliated with any 12-step recovery program, but you will hear them mentioned throughout the course of an interview. Today on the show, Edwin M. from Granby, Massachusetts, by way of Rwanda. Before we get to the show, if I could ask a favor, take a moment and provide a rating or a comment. Let us know what you think of the show. This will help us expand our reach and improve the show. Thanks. I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, Lee. How are you?
Good morning. I am really good this morning. How are you?
I'm well. Hey, what's going on today? What's on the schedule?
So today I'm really happy to let you know that we've got Edwin M. with us this morning. He is from Granby, Mass. by way of Rwanda, and he's here to share with us on the God idea.
Terrific. Well, Edwin, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an honor.
What is your sobriety date?
My sobriety date is February 15th, 2019.
Well, we start the show out in the same way every day. We ask the guest to read the reflection for today, March 15th. Would you help us get started?
Of course. The daily reflections, March 15th, the God idea. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance on the spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 52. Like a blind man gradually being restored to sight, I slowly groped my way to the third step. Having realized that only a power greater than myself could rescue me from the hopelessness abyss I was in, I knew that this was a power that I had to grasp, and that it would be my anchor in the midst of a sea of woes. Even though my faith at the time was minuscule, it was big enough to make me see that it was time for me to discard my reliance on my prideful ego and replace it with the steady strength that could only come from a power far greater than myself.
Well, the God word is all over this one.
Yes, it is.
What do you think about prideful ego, and how was that working in your life before you got into AA?
So I chuckled at prideful ego because I think I had problems with all kinds of ego, not only the pride ones. I was raised to believe I was young, gifted, and talented, and therefore could do anything under my efforts and everything I could do. I mean, I everything I did, even in sobriety after, was without the help of working with my sponsor, would have been driven by ego. I mean, I think more than anything, one of the gifts that I learned through the program was how ego played a part even in the way I was wrongfully treated, right? Like this idea that even when you have what they call something we as alcoholics can't deal with, justifiable anger, that even then you can turn around and see how your ego has played its role in all of it. So for me, when I hear prideful ego, it's this inability to reconcile with how much you have no control over things, and how even when you're justified in things, there's ways you can even get better and self-reflect.
So tell me about your conception of a higher power.
So I'm sure you've probably heard this on this podcast too. I'm also a recovering Catholic. I did everything in terms of the Catholic Church, save for being ordained. And I think for me, I never doubted the existence of a higher power. I just believed my higher power wanted nothing to do with me. And so, I strayed a lot. It's an ebb and flow. Even to this day, in 2 years of sobriety, I still feel like my spiritual growth is really driven by the ability for me to acknowledge the humility I have to hold in order to acknowledge that there's a higher power at play. Again, being someone who's been so accustomed to working as hard and as tirelessly to achieve whatever they want, even my drinking, when people told me I couldn't drive while I drank, I still wanted to prove them wrong. So for me, a higher power is a Christian God, but also one in which I don't need to go to a pope, or I don't need to pray to a normal being in order to reach that higher power.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what transpired? What brought you into the rooms?
Yeah, so I'm one of those people whose bottom rose up to find them. I grew up a refugee. So basically, I was born in Uganda because of the genocide in Rwanda. One of the adages I always hold through sobriety is this idea of heal so that your trauma does not become tradition. And I feel like being a Rwandan and being a survivor of such atrocities, or at least being the child of survivors. Like, for example, my parents walked across as kids in the 50s. They walked across Rwanda in escape of violence and got to Uganda. And they eventually met in the future, and they had a family together. But, it's this idea of they survived and they pulled themselves up by the bootstraps. And so therefore, there's not that much acknowledgement of trauma when you're just trying to survive. And I think with my generation, at least with my siblings and the generations to come after, it's this idea of how much the trauma they did not deal with has been translated into traditions. And so seeing a lot of the people in my family and a lot of Rwandans I knew deal with alcohol in a way where I always tell this joke where my brother was getting married and his best man, and I flew back from the United States when I was still drinking. And we went out to my cousin's place for his bachelor party. It was small and everything, but I was driving everybody else out to a club that night. And so I had one drink and I was responsible, and I stopped. I was like, I'm driving. So I'm drunk. And my cousins brought out drinks. And I was like, I can't drink anymore. I'm driving. And they laughed and they're like, man, take that American custom out of here. Rwandan cars drive themselves, so that's where I was coming from. And I think for me, watching the people around me use and abuse alcohol as a kid, I just kind of refused to do so. And one of the things, the way I was raised in my culture is my parents, they compare in order to encourage, right? So you can do better. You don't want to turn out like so-and-so. So I have this brilliant uncle who had to go to war to end the genocide. And he had so much trauma that he had to deal with. And, he dealt with it by self-medicating a lot with alcohol. And he was brilliant. He was well-spoken. He was outgoing. He was basically me. And my mom would always be like, you don't want to be like him. You don't want to be like him. Look at him. So I resisted the urge to drink. I always knew as a kid, even in high school, when my friends started drinking, that I was going to drink, but it was going to be on my terms. So I resisted. And then I graduated high school in Rwanda and got a scholarship to the United States. And the saying and the advice I would get from people was, be careful. Your scholarship is not a guaranteed thing. And also be careful how you carry yourself, because they could take this away from you and you could be deported. So I kind of focused on books. And, honestly, I always had this fear that if I took anything outside of the natural things that pushed me to be who I was, I would get to a place that I wouldn't be able to get to naturally. So I resisted drinking. I was an RA in college, so you didn't want to be caught drinking and lose that position as well. So a lot of the things I didn't drink, not because I didn't want to, but because I was just like waiting my turn. It's like, I'm going to get my shot. And when I do, I'm going to do it to the best of my abilities. And that basically came when I graduated college. I went to a conference, and my advisor, who knew I didn't drink, but I really didn't know why I didn't drink. I didn't know I was an alcoholic. And that's another thing I say when I share my experience with Victim Hope. I was an alcoholic before I picked up my first drink. I remember when I was a kid, I used to be the kid who was to refuse to bring my parents alcohol from the fridge. And I was like, ask one of your other 6 kids, not me. And my dad used to smoke, and I used to take his brand new packs and I'd break them in half like a brat. And I say that a lot when I share, because by the time I checked myself in, I was drinking and smoking just as much, if not more, than my parents. And so the first drink I had was a gin and tonic, and it blew my mind. I had it because my advisor, I went to this conference and I won an award, and I was exceptionally happy and proud of myself. And my advisor was like, I know you don't drink, but literally you're an undergrad who just won an award and you've beat out graduate students and professional students. Like, you deserve a drink. And I had a gin and tonic, and, as I said, the rest was history. It wasn't like I lost my mind or I completely, spiraled into my alcoholic tendencies at that time. But, it started a track that led me to where I am today. I then moved to the University of Massachusetts, where I pursued my graduate degree, my PhD. And I just remember that with the PhD, you work hard, you play hard. And I don't know if anyone has been on this podcast in the Western Massachusetts. I mean, especially in the winter, there's nothing else. Everything that is open is a bar at a certain time. So me and my friends would work hard and we'd go out and drink. And that was around 2011. And it was also then where I finally lost the foundations of the quaint New England college experience. And I was all on my own. And I'm born on Christmas, and I'm a twin born on Christmas. And usually I go home for Christmas. But that 2011, that first time I was in the Pioneer Valley in Amherst, I did not. And I remember it distinctly that on December 25th, I ordered a Domino's pizza and I had a rum and Coke. No Coke. I couldn't even get the Coke. And the pizza place was a walk away from me, but I had it delivered to me on my birthday. And the guy who delivered the pizza was like, dude, you could have walked to get this. And I was in such a state of mind that I was like, no. And I spent that New Year's just wallowing in my own pity, me and sorrow, and then in terms of life becoming unmanageable, what ended up happening is that, the toxic environment of graduate programs and just the PhD environment, just led me to just really double down on my working, burning the candle at both ends. And in order to sustain that and to feed that was my efforts to party and drink as much as I can. A turning point for me, I would say, was in 2016 when I dealt with some serious loss. And coming from lab and research, I fell off my bike around 2:00 in the morning, and it led to me having to get a hernia. That same month, that was October 2016, I got my wallet stolen at Whole Foods. And being an immigrant, and literally, you can take my money, I don't care, but my identification is so important in this country. And it was insane. And then my grandfather and my uncle died in that month, and I could not fly home to bury them. And the worst part about the whole thing is I couldn't remember the last thing I said to them. And it really tore me apart. I pride myself in being someone who's connected to family. I've lived my life from country to country, so my connection to home is always the connections I have to the people I love. And, I use that as an excuse, in all honesty, to just kind of double down on my drinking. And it just kind of progressed to a point where I was getting to a point where I couldn't even stop drinking, even if I tried. I would wake up in the morning and say, this is the last drink I would have. It would be next to my bedside. I'd finish that drink. I'd go to work. And then by the time I got home, I would have bought another 6-pack or whatever. And so it was at a point where I knew my life was becoming unmanageable. And I think one of the things that really settled for me, and I share this every time I share my experience, strength, and hope, is that the worst of it, right before I checked myself in, I would go to a local cemetery near my house. I would tell my roommate that I was actually going to work, but I would tell work that I was sick. And so I would go to a local cemetery and I would sit there in my car with my cigarettes and my alcohol, and I would drink to the point where the keepers of the cemetery would come up to my car and they'd be like, are you okay? Are you here? Particularly visit anyone? And, I would be like, no. And in my mind, I'm thinking this is me. This is where I want to stay. This is my grave. This is where I feel comfortable. No one's going to bother me in a cemetery. So it got really bad. And then I did the whole geographical relocation where I thought in, December 2018 that I would go home and I would control the narrative and try to quit this drinking. My roommates and my friends had kind of told me that they were worried about it, and they'd found out that I'd been lying about going to work and stuff. And I wasn't really keeping up with my graduate program. But it was also tied to a very toxic relationship with my advisor. And we can talk about that in terms of the fourth step and coming to amends with that. But What ended up happening is I went home over Christmas thinking I would not drink, which is a joke, right? Because Christmas and New Year's are the biggest drinking holidays in Rwanda. And they didn't know what I was going through in the United States. So I drank again. And by the time I got back home, back to the States in January, my cousin-in-law, what ended up happening to her a week out from her wedding, she's one of the coolest people I ever knew. She got murdered without any explanation, got her throat slit at her parents' house by someone. And it was a week out of her wedding. And it broke me apart. I was unstable. I had realized I couldn't stop drinking. And I used her as an excuse. And basically, my roommate was like, we need to check you into someplace. And so for me, being a person who hadn't picked up my first drink till I was 22 or 23, I knew I wanted to be that person again, where I didn't need alcohol to socialize. I didn't need alcohol to deal with the anxieties of all the things that were going through in my life. So I jumped at the chance. I went into sobriety. I checked myself into a rehab center, and I was there for a while. And that's where I got introduced to the program. And that's, the rest of my life is different because of that.
That is a very moving story.
Thank you.
I just wanted to acknowledge that loss. I don't know how you make sense of that.
Yeah, no, and I think also coming from where I'm from, coming from the collective loss that people from my country have dealt with, it was always difficult, especially when I was going through all the challenges over here remotely, to like kind of validate the struggles, because it's like, who do you turn to? Do you talk to your parents who literally escaped a genocide and walked across country to tell them that your graduate program was becoming unmanageable and you had a horrible advisor, or that you were struggling with alcohol? Like, how dare you, So a lot of that had to do with self-sabotage for me, and just this ability to not acknowledge or like really validate how real my struggles were, just because they didn't match up or they weren't in like the sorrow Olympics of my history,
It says here that in the daily reflection, it says that having realized that only a power greater than myself could rescue me from the hopeless abyss I was in, I knew that this was a power I had to grasp, and that it would be the anchor in the midst of a sea of woes. And I'm wondering, in the face of atrocities that you talked about, and a legacy of trauma, and then this trauma that you're dealing with your advisor, and then the terrible tragedy of the loss of your family member, did you feel like your higher power was with you through all of this?
Oh, I didn't give my higher power two thoughts. I was too consumed with everything, or just trying to silence the thoughts in my head. I've always felt, and this is something that came really clear to me during sobriety, like, as much as I've struggled, as much as the experiences that I've gone through could seem overwhelming, things have kind of figured themselves out for me. And that's not on my effort. That's not me. So clearly someone was watching out for me. I never got pulled over for drinking. I never killed anyone in a car. I definitely gave myself enough opportunities to do all that, but I didn't. So I think more than anything, realizing that my higher power was looking out for me, was I lost another friend when I got out of the detox center. And I don't know if anyone remembers that Ethiopian Airlines flight that crashed. It was one of those crazy Boeing 777s that were like glitchy. And one of them was an Ethiopian airline flight, which had one of my closest friends from high school on them, and he was on there. And I remember the first thing I did is I went to a meeting and I shared. I didn't drink because of him. I didn't. I was like, this person lost their life. Like, how dare I use them as an excuse to live my life as subpar? If they can't live theirs, I need to live mine at the best of my abilities. And I remember that's when it kind of clicked for me, where it's like, I don't have to drink over this. I do not have to drink over this. And I think in terms of my higher power, I think my higher power has always been talking to me. You just have to be able to listen. And the best way to do that, especially as alcoholics, at least for me, is to clear all that noise out with all the booze I was drinking, and just be able to listen.
Well, it's wonderful that you've found a higher power that can work for you today. What do you say to somebody that questions the existence of a higher power that would stand by in the face of all these atrocities?
I would say patience. I would say, at least in terms of the adages of AA, it's take it one day at a time. I think we believe that oxygen works without a problem. again, I'm a scientist, but like we have truths and norms that we believe without necessarily feeling them or touching them. And I think especially a lot of people, at least for me, when I came into these rooms, what I struggled with is the conventional idea of a higher power that I had just did not mesh with my ideas. For example, being raised a Catholic was really difficult for me in terms of reconciling what the Catholic Church did in Rwanda. You know, separating God from the institution of religion is an exercise everybody needs to partake in. And I think for me, that's what ended up happening is I realized that I didn't have to be perfect, that I could be faulty, right? Like, if you think about St. Peter, for example, he denied Jesus Christ 3 times and still got a whole cathedral, and he was the first pope, and he built a whole faith and a message around him. If people who knew Jesus Christ directly, let him die at the cross and denied him, could find salvation, then there's got to be a way for us to do it too. And I think we hear this in the rooms all the time. Like, don't beat yourself up about trying to imagine some gray-haired beard up in the sky trying to control everything you do. No, make your higher power the good you see in people. Make your higher power the promises that you see working in AA rooms every day. You know, what helped me get back to church was the fact that I would go to a meeting at a local church, and every day after that meeting, I would just go sit in the pews of the church and just listen. It wasn't a service, I would just listen. And then it became a service, but it was all under these tenets of the program that allowed me to redefine my relationship to a higher power, right? And another thing, I'm a student of religion. I've looked at the Quran, I've looked at the Torah, I've looked at the First Testament. They're all basically the same. They have the same prophets. So, I mean, I think the idea that like there's one size fits all, that doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it needs to make sense. Another thing is you have no idea why you could not stop picking up that drink. Even though you promised yourself, even though you put all the tricks in your mind to stop drinking, you still couldn't figure out why you couldn't. But then you trusted that there was a program to help you. So you got to trust. You just got to trust that there's a higher power. You don't need all the X's and O's to call this play.
As a scientist, don't you see in some ways, or did you struggle at all with the concept of, faith versus proof?
Yeah, all the time. I think, just full disclosure, my background is in environmental neurotoxicology. I look at the effects of chemicals on the human brain. So the irony of that is I knew exactly the dosage. I knew everything I needed to do as I drank. I was one of those people who was sometimes way too smart for my own good. And I remember checking myself into rehab, and the people in the room in the rehab be turning around every time they started talking about the brain chemistry, and they'd look at me because I studied the brain, and they were like, is this right? And I'd literally tell them, listen, I'm on this side of the window. I want to get to the other side of the window. So like, I'm not commenting one way or the other. And I think one of the things that I always hold to as a scientist is that one thing, I always claim Einstein said this, but I don't know proof, but he said, religion and science are not at odds. It's just that science is too young to understand. And I think that's something that I've always held true for me, is that I don't have to deny my faith or my belief in a higher power because, I know how the aurora forms. Like, that's not how this works. I think science is the hopefully objective way of asking questions and finding answers. But there's one thing people don't realize, is that every time you report out a result in science, you have to report out the potential that it's wrong. You cannot just say it's true. One of the things my advisor taught me that I hold on to this day is that when you say that you're about to prove a hypothesis, that is wrong. We don't prove things right or wrong in science. We do experiments and we show results and we make conclusions on the results, but you don't prove anything. It was there before you were there. So I try not to be too smart for my own good. And honestly, I just try to let my curiosity in terms of my science inform the way I approach my faith. Like, it's okay to question. It's okay to question. Like I said, back to the whole, the apostles and Jesus, like they were questioning all the time. But you have to have faith. You have to have faith.
You're a PhD, smart guy. I've noticed that sometimes it's the scientists, the engineers, the left brain thinkers that struggle in this program in the beginning. because they're constantly debating everything, right? They have to agree with it. What would you suggest to a newcomer who might be coming from that exact same spot?
Shut up and listen. You didn't get there as a scientist by knowing anything in the second grade. You got there by accruing knowledge and getting to a place where you could make conclusions about ideas. I think the best scientists are those who acknowledge, again, that potential of error in their thinking. It's hard. And I think one of the things is it goes back again to this reading. It's your ego. The fact that you're in denial, you're trying to find a way out. It's escapism. It's trying to figure out a way not to do what the program is asking you to do, not to sign up to receive these promises because all of a sudden it's tied to a God that you don't believe in. But you forget that there's 12 steps in the program. There's a lot more to it. And the book says, make your higher power whoever you need your higher power to be in order to get through it. And I think if you think about it in terms of an exam, nobody goes into an exam knowing all the answers. They go into an exam and hope that they can get to the right answers. So as a newcomer, when you come in, it's very easy for you to be like, this sounds like a lot of hoopla. It just doesn't sound right. But at the same time, no theory started out correct. We thought the world was flat, and then we figured out it wasn't, and people lost their lives with that claim. If for every evidence you have that there's no higher power, I'm sure there's a scientist out there who can give you evidence that there is. Science.
Edwin, this has been a phenomenal conversation. We definitely have to have you back. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And I think one of the reasons I accept a lot of these invitations to share my experience, strength, and hope is being a Black man in this country, being a person of color. I realized that there's not enough people who look like me in these spaces. And it's not, if you look at the history of this country, for example, let's forget Rwanda, the trauma that's been experienced by people of color is extreme. And they're drinking too. And I think one of the things that I really struggled with was how can I, like finding a sponsor, for example, they tell you, find someone you connect with, right? How do you remove all the physical features or all the things that, like, of course, a sponsor in, Western Massachusetts is not going to connect with me completely because I'm from Rwanda. I have an experience that they can never relate to, but we share the idea that we want to stop drinking and that we've had experiences that could help us get to that spot. So I think for me, these rooms, the traditions of these rooms are such a good, affirmation for me. And I think as I continue to walk through these rooms, it's this idea that like we need to get this word out to even more people. And I think more than anything, I would end with this on top of the heal so that your trauma doesn't become tradition. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay not to be okay, and that's fine. And there's people out there who can help you with that. And there's a room. One thing, finally, the beauty of these rooms, especially with the pandemic, is I can't tell you how many of my normie friends are struggling right now. They're struggling, and they literally don't know where to turn. And for me, they're like, you seem so zen and so at peace with them. It's like, literally, I have a program that teaches me to accept things and just let things happen. And I think the beauty of this program is that it's for everybody. If you're willing to stop to drink, it doesn't matter your sexual orientation. It doesn't matter your race, creed. It literally is in the book. You are welcome here. And I think for everybody too, as it's okay not to be okay, but also it's okay if you slip up. This program is not about perfection. It's about progress. And we have to continue to believe that. I don't live in fear of relapse. I know it's a reality and I'm not afraid of it, but like I just take it one day at a time.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful. I think I speak for both of us when I say we're so happy to have your voice on this show today. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to Edwin for stopping by, and thanks to you, the listeners. I appreciate your support. If you want to join us online, you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/Daily Reflection Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at Daily Reflector. If you want to read about recovery, we've got a blog at blog.dailyreflectionpodcast.com. We've got some new writers, some guest writers, writing some awesome stories from the perspective of people in recovery. Want to check that out? blog.dailyreflectionpodcast.com. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.